Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome back to those of you who were here in the morning. My name is Peter Broad. I'm a journalist based in Prague, and I shall be chairing this panel, which is a distinguished one with members from 4 continents: Europe, Asia, America, and Australia. Only Africa is missing, but that is compensated in other panels. Let me first introduce the panelists, and I shall start with the ladies and go on in alphabetical order. From Washington comes Bei Feng, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the US Department of State. Mrs. Feng works in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, and she oversees US public diplomacy and public affairs. Before joining the state, she was a journalist, including stints as a war correspondent in Afghanistan and Iraq. Let me add that in your brochure you will find much more detailed biographical entries for all participants, so I would like you to refer to them if you need any more details. Dunja Mijatović hails from Bosnia and Herzegovina, but she now works in Vienna. She's an expert in media, law, and regulation, and currently holds the post of representative on freedom of the media at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has its headquarters in Vienna. Mrs. Mijatović originally comes from Bosnia and Herzegovina, where she helped set up the Communications Regulatory Agency, and she has worked in similar capacity in 9 other countries. Gareth Evans, whom many of you saw this morning already, comes to us from Canberra and Melbourne. He is Chancellor of the Australian National University, and between 1988 and 1996, he served as Australia's Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was chair or co-chair of several important global commissions, including the International Crisis Group based in Brussels, which he headed between 2000 and 2009. Lobsang Sangay bears the title of Sikong, or political leader, of the Central Tibetan Administration, the body we journalists normally call the Tibetan government in exile. That body is based in Dharamsala in northern India, and Mr. Sangay has been elected to the post of Sikong in a democratic election conducted among Tibetans living abroad, living in exile. Mr. Sangay was the first Tibetan to graduate from Harvard Law School, and anybody who has seen the movie Paper Chase knows that that's no mean achievement even for a Yankee. Mr. Sangay has lectured at various universities in Europe, Asia, and Northern America, mostly on issues connected with Tibet, international human rights law, and conflict resolution. Last but not least, Grigory Yavlinsky, who has been to the Forum 2000 conference several times before. He comes from Moscow. He's a Russian economist turned politician. Between 1993 and 2003, he was a member of the Russian parliament. He was one of the founders of the Russian Democratic Party, Yabloko, and its chairman for 15 years. He ran for the presidency of the Russian Federation and now teaches economy at the High School of Economics in Moscow. He also chairs the board of the Center for Economic and Political Research. Now, what is this panel all about? It is obvious that free people and free nations need free media. Free societies depend on free media. Even people in unfree societies, that is, people living under authoritarian rule, depend on free media, namely those that speak to them from abroad. But what are the current conditions for media freedom around the world? We are witnessing 2 contradictory trends that could be summed up by the notions of choice and control. On the one hand, the growth of the internet, satellite TV channels, and social networks has brought about an unprecedented flow of information and commentary. We have more choice than ever before. At the same time, various global freedom analyses indicate that in some areas of the world, the proliferation of new media technologies is not propelling greater political freedom. In this panel, we want to see what are the main challenges to media freedom in modern pluralistic societies. We want to ask whether media technology advances have an impact on authoritarian regimes. We want to explore whether greater media fragmentation harbors any dangers for democracy. And we want to explore some of the pressures that media encounter from governments, corporations, and special interest groups. I will ask all the participants to give us a short introductory statements, then we'll discuss among the panelists, and of course, as usual, we'll also give you, the public, a chance to ask questions. I would ask the participants to please speak in the order I've indicated, and therefore, the floor is yours, Bei Feng.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been in this position for just under a year in the government. And as Peter said, before that I was a journalist for about 11 years. So it's actually nice to have a topic that means so much to me in both capacities. I started out as the Beijing bureau chief for an American magazine, U.S. News and World Report. And then I covered the wars in Afghanistan in 2001 to 2002, and then in Iraq in 2003 and 2004. And working in a war zone, in Afghanistan particularly, I was able to see things from both sides because I was a journalist there first, and then I worked there again for the State Department in 2009. And I saw clearly there how crucial it is for there to be objective voices on the ground, speaking truth to power, even when it made my life difficult when I was working in the government, that there were journalists who were talking to everyone and asking lots of questions and making it more complicated for diplomats to do their jobs. But I saw that it was a crucial role. And now in my role at the State Department overseeing press and public diplomacy for Europe and Eurasia, I use my experience to make sure that what we're doing on the people-to-people front, the public diplomacy front, is in line with our policy goals and with the reality on the ground. So in Europe, where I'm focused now, I see the challenges in a couple of ways. One is sort of institutional or governmental limits. So for example, in Hungary, we've engaged in vigorous discussions on the governmental level about troubling efforts to weaken institutional checks and balances within the government, and the importance of preserving the integrity and independence of the judiciary and the free press. We're encouraged that Hungary continues to consult on these issues with the Council of Europe's Venice Commission, a process that's already led to some positive changes. We also urge the Hungarian government to have a dialogue on these matters with civil society, as we believe that a strong democracy depends on a transparent and inclusive political process. We also have the issue of intimidation in some of our other countries, and that can be overt or covert, and it might give rise to an element of self-censorship as well. My colleague Gregory will probably speak a little bit more about what happened 6 years ago on October 7th in Russia, when Anna Politkovskaya was killed in her apartment building. And with her death, the Russian people lost a voice that courageously sought to report the truth. And we remember her legacy both as a journalist and as a champion of human dignity. So as a diplomat now, and working for the State Department, we'll continue to shine a spotlight on this case and others, such as the American Paul Klebnikov, who was gunned down in Moscow 8 years ago. So I'll leave my remarks very brief in saying that advancing media freedom is a regular part of what we do in the U.S. In our diplomatic work. We also work in bilateral discussions with other governments and in multilateral bodies, with the UN Human Rights Council, the OSCE, and the Organization of American States. And I'll be happy to answer whatever questions, both in that capacity and in my previous role as a journalist.
Thank you. Dunja Mijatović.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here and to have the possibility to address this honorable forum and to share my views as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media. on the issue that is so close to the daily work I'm performing. Media and freedom is something that I'm facing every day. But in order to try to answer the questions that you posed and what are the actual challenges nowadays, I would like to be maybe more direct, possibly radical. When I say what is a challenge nowadays is to preserve what we have. And to preserve what we have, when I say this, I mean to preserve freedom of speech as a human right, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, because this freedom is challenged on a daily basis in so many countries, including all democracies. So I'm here not talking only about new emerging democracies. What we are facing at the moment, it is very much of concern to the work my office is doing. Also talking here about the basic rights of people to freely express their views, sometimes critical, sometimes provocative, satirical, to touch upon the issues that are taboo topics, the issues that are very sensitive and painful for the societies. I come from a very troubled society, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and if we were not able to touch upon the issues that were so sensitive and so painful in so many ways, we would not be able to overcome. We are still in the process of overcoming the troubles from the war, but in order to try to do this, there is a need for discussion and for dialogue. What is happening at the moment is also, and it's as we speak, we have people, journalists, bloggers, social media activists, imprisoned, threatened, intimidated, put in prison for issues that are nothing to do with journalism, and this is what the governments are telling me when I try to see these people in prison. But if we scratch the laws, if we scratch the cases of the people that are in prison in so many parts within the OSCE region, unfortunately, you see that they are in prison just because of critical views, because they touched upon the powerless, they wanted to criticize the presidents, the powerful. And this is something what we have to discuss in the 21st century, which is very unfortunate. And in a way, it is quite scary, if I can put it this way. And it is something that can undermine and threaten the values of democratic societies, the values of free speech. The issue is discussed more and more in media. There was an article that I found just before coming here, was in a Washington Post by Professor Jonathan Turley. He's a professor at George Washington University. And what he wrote, I found extremely moving and true. He said that as in a troubled marriage, in a way, we seems to be falling out of love with free speech in many parts of the world. And unable to divorce ourselves from this defining right, we take refuge instead of forcing and trying to have this forced silence. In so many parts of the world that legislation is introduced, regulation is introduced in order to have society that is peaceful and in harmony, because we will not discuss topics that are controversial and provocative. This is not the way I think this world should go, and this is not the way I think this topic will be solved if we become more silent. Becoming more silent and more cautious about what we say and how we say it, we can only move back to the closed and dark societies. And this is something that my office is doing, and continuously raising this issue with the governments of 56 participating states in order to remind them of the values and the commitments that they voluntarily agreed upon. And I would end here this introduction.
Thank you. Gareth Evans, please.
Well, thank you, Peter. I thought it might be useful to focus on the issues for media freedom and governance that were thrown up by the WikiLeaks affair. Now a couple of years old, sure, but the implications of it still very much linger on. I do this partly because I am, for my sins, an Australian compatriot of Julian Assange. But more relevantly, I'm someone who has been on both sides of the secrecy exposure debate. As a human rights activist and global NGO head for many years, often spent trying to prise open government secrets, but also as a government minister for many years, trying to protect secrets. Perhaps I should say quickly at the outset that I'm not a huge personal fan of Julian Assange because I think his motives are far less idealistic than they are anarchic and megalomaniacal. But I'm wholly opposed to his prosecution or persecution through any court system anywhere for his role in putting on the public record hundreds of thousands of pages of classified government information. Whatever the appropriateness of pursuing him through the courts on completely different issues, I do think it's demeaning and unproductive and probably counterproductive to pursue him for those disclosures, and governments should not. But my basic position on all this is that governments, some lines do have to be drawn somewhere if good government is to be possible. Just as in our personal and family lives, a zone of privacy really is crucial to our capacity to develop and sustain the relationships that matter most to us. There is such a thing as too much information. The trick, of course, is to know how and where to draw lines that concede neither too much nor too little to those who will always have a vested interest, for good reasons or bad, in avoiding scrutiny. And too often the WikiLeaks debate has been conducted in far too black and white terms. In government, any leak of any kind to the media will, by definition, be embarrassing to someone, somewhere in the system. But we need to distinguish, I think, between three categories of media leaks and the embarrassments they cause. First of all, those which are totally defensible. Secondly, those which are totally indefensible. And then a third category of those which are undesirable for various reasons, but which we should be prepared to live with. A few words on each of these. Defensible leaks are certainly some of those that were published in the WikiLeaks saga on classic freedom of information grounds, uncovering abuses that might otherwise have remained forever concealed. Good examples were disclosures about helicopter gunship killings in Iraq, about corruption of the Ben Ali family in Tunisia, and disclosures about some of the incredible weakness of the achievement in Afghanistan. Also, disclosures showing the weakness of the case against some of the Guantanamo confined terror suspects. In all these kinds of instances, sometimes whistles do just have to be blown, and it's defensible when this happens. Indefensible links, on the other hand, are those which put intelligence sources or other individuals at direct physical risk, as did some of the early Afghanistan and Zimbabwe-related published WikiLeaks. Those which expose exploratory positions of negotiators in conflict resolution situations, which will usually, such disclosures, only help the extremists and the spoilers, or disclosures which indicate the bottom line, for example, of trade negotiations. Disclosures which may be just as indefensible, but which I think need case-by-case evaluation, because often more transparency is possible than governments will admit, are those which are claimed to put at risk intelligence methods as distinct from personnel and as distinct from military operational effectiveness. The difficulty with all these cases is that the stakes are so high that you can't really just leave this to the judgment of people like Assange and the WikiLeaks organisers and the media outlets that they use to make the necessary calls without consultation with relevant officials. And I think sensible governments will facilitate that process on a kind of without prejudice basis. The third category of leaks is those which are undesirable, but nonetheless I think we ought to be prepared to live with. These are the sort of leaks of which there are many during the WikiLeaks affair, disclosing, for example, private assessments of leaders and their countries by senior ministerial diplomatic officials. For example, the disclosure of the Singapore leader Lee Kuan Yew's views about Malaysia, the local embassy, the US embassy's views in Jakarta on Indonesia's first family. Disclosures which are really fun gossip to have out there in the public domain, but which are bound to create real hurt with no obviously redeeming public policy justification. The problem, of course, is not that these things are said. Everyone knows they're being said, as one leader famously responded to an apologising Hillary Clinton in the context of one of these WikiLeaks. You should hear what we say about you. But the problem is them becoming public. Loss of face in Asian cultures in particular is much more painful than Westerners ever tend to begin to understand. But I do think governments should respond philosophically to these kinds of leaks. Most embarrassments of this kind will have few lasting implications for government relationships. There's bound to be some bruises, some tensions in the first subsequent meetings of the players in question. I know because I've been in these situations. And quite likely there will be some continuing personal tensions that will inhibit effective cooperative decision-making on some issues. But life will basically move on because it has to. Nor will this fundamentally change what diplomats say behind closed doors, because people will always talk, and diplomats especially, because assessments of personality, of behaviour and of likely behaviour are just the stock in trade of this profession. But the point I want to make is that these kinds of leaks should not be naively applauded as somehow contributing to better government. They won't, essentially because they're going to impact profoundly, if not on what's actually said orally, that will go on, they will impact on what is written down within the system and what is widely circulated. And that in turn will significantly, in my judgment, inhibit the free exchange of free exchange of information within government, reinstating these sort of silos which it's absolutely critical to break down if you want good government. So I think the ironic effect, the ironic result of acting to improve the free flow of information and the presumed quality of decision-making that goes with the free flow of information, I fear the net effect of all of this will be to reduce the free flow of information within government and to increase the prospect of decisions being made in ignorance. I think it's also bound to lead to a greater premium being placed by governments on the products of covert intelligence gathering, which is generally less leak-prone, but in my own considerable experience is usually much worse value for money than the more overt kind of information gathering. All that said, those who see significantly more potential for harm than for good in WikiLeaks, which is sometimes my position, I think we're probably trying to resist an inexorable tide. With the new technology of communication, information transfer that so much of this conference is about, with this making things vastly more open than they were just a few years ago, the media and the public expect more and more, and younger generations in particular are very hard to convince about the need for a zone of privacy anywhere. So I think the bottom line is we're going to have to get used to more and more exposure. We're going to have to make the best of it, but that should not stop us drawing some lines where they still really matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Lobsang.
Thank you. It's a great privilege and honor to be in this forum, and We all miss Václav Havel, who continues to be remembered for his great legacy and being a friend of Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he's really missed, not just by Tibetans, but particularly in Czech Republic, but also in Europe and the world at large. I'm really privileged to be participating in this forum. And I would like to present a case, a rather very difficult case of where there is not just censorship and manipulation of media in the virtual world, but also in the physical world. Obviously, being a Tibetan, I'll put forth the case of Tibet. As we all know, China spends more on internal security than on external defense. $111 billion for internal security of China and $207 billion to its external defense. Now, part of that internal security, they spend billions on internet security. Now, in China, if you are in China, if you try to search 3 T's, which are taboos, one is Tiananmen, one is Taiwan, one is Tibet. These 3 T's are taboos in China, and if you search inside China, you will not get any information other than the Chinese media. What would you do when there is physical and virtual censorship over these issues? I got elected 14 months ago and took over the position of the political head of the Tibetan people. Let me give you 2 personal experiences. We have a former journalist now who is working at the State Department of US News and World Report. The Beijing bureau chief of Time magazine, Hannah Beach, was interested in interviewing me, and we exchanged a couple of emails. And then one day, I received an email from Hannah Beach saying, I would like to ask you following questions. And I thought, a journalist being so generous, sending me questions, she wants to interview me. And I thought, wait a second, she's such a veteran journalist, she should not be giving me all these questions beforehand. Then I looked at the name from I received the email, it did say Hannah Beach. But when I pressed the click reply button, it went to a Tibetan representative. Then I looked down, there was an attachment. In fact, it was a virus. So had I opened that email, not only my computer would have been corrupted, and had I replied, it was not going to Hannah Beach, rather it was going to another Tibetan representative and to other Tibetans where their computers will also be corrupted. Then I found Hannah Beach's email and I wrote to her. I said, did you send these questions? She wrote back and said, no, we know it came from. And then she wrote a piece in the Time magazine about not just a censorship, but in fact, a way to control and corrupt my computer. So obviously I got 2 coverage. She did come to Dharamsala, that's in India, and interviewed me and wrote a piece about it. And then she also wrote a piece about attempt by someone, the capital which starts from B, trying to send a virus to me and other friends. So what would you do when so many millions and billions of dollars are spent on controlling the internet? Now, another experience. On September 16th, I had a good news in the sense I went to the Tibetan parliament with 6 of my members' team, and the parliament confirmed my cabinet. When I returned to my office, the staff members in my office were in very bad mood. And I said, what happened? I thought we had a good news because I got the cabinet confirmed in 5 minutes by the Tibetan parliament, which is a good news. They all said, well, didn't you see your email? I said, no, you should. Because one memo that I sent to the US about my plan to visit US and meet all the senators and congressmen and other people were leaked to the whole world because someone stole my email and leaked to the whole world as to my plans. And they were very nervous as to my plan to DC could be jeopardized because now many people know about this plan. And they wanted to change the schedule or the date of my trip. And I said, not so. We will follow exactly the same schedule and try to meet same people and more, so that the person or the capital or the government who was trying to censor or sabotage my attempt will get a message that we will not be threatened or undermined by the attempt. So I did follow the same schedule and did go to DC, and they were kind enough to meet me. Now this is a censorship on the part of virtual world. This is what happens. So censorship is not happening only inside China, but even outside. If you're a supporter of Tibet or friends of Tibet, and like me, how would you feel when you open your email every day, you know someone else is reading? So that's the world I live in. Now, as for situation inside Tibet, you might have read that now 56 Tibetans have committed self-immolations. They burned themselves, of which 44 or 45 have died. One of the main reasons why it's happening, why this form of drastic protest is happening, is because of lack of free speech and free media. If the Tibetan people are allowed to organize demonstrations, rallies, and hunger strike, and reported by Chinese media openly and freely, Chinese government will understand the problem of the Tibetan people and could address the issue. Now, because there is no freedom of speech and free media in Tibet, and if you participate in demonstration, you will be arrested, tortured, often disappear, then Tibetans are resorting to a very drastic form of protest, that is self-immolation. So Mao Zedong said, wherever there is repression, there will be resentment. So because of repression of the Chinese government in Tibet, there is resentment by the Tibetan people, and is in the worst possible form by a human being, in the form of self-immolation. As far as Tibetan administration is concerned, we discourage drastic action by Tibetans, including self-immolation. As a Buddhist, we pray for them, and as a Tibetan, we do show solidarity, but we understand why they're doing it. Because there is no freedom of speech, there is no free media. Hence, there is no understanding as to what are the real grievances of the Tibetan people. Now, if other news media try to go to Tibet, let's say from Australia, ABC, they did try, Sky News, they managed to go to some Tibetan areas, but they're arrested, they're harassed, BBC attempted, CNN attempted, they're told that your visa could be revoked if you stay on in Tibet. So there is a physical censorship of even journalists attempting to enter into Tibet and report as to what's happening. So this is the tragedy. That's why the Reporters Without Borders came out with a report saying that there's so much censorship going on inside Tibet. Chinese government has virtually shut down Tibet. No journalists are allowed. The censorship is so bad, it's worse than Pyongyang, the capital city of North Korea. Because at least in Pyongyang, there is a journalist. But in Lhasa, you're not allowed. Not only you're not allowed, if you are there, you will be in trouble. So in that sense, the case of Tibet is where there is virtual as well as physical censorship of the media. Now, Chinese, or the China, built Great Wall, historically speaking, to prevent barbarians, quote-unquote barbarians, Mongolians from invading China. It did not work. Mongolians did invade China. Now, the Chinese government is trying to build a firewall for people to have access to information from inside China, but it is also not likely to work, because we know there was something called Berlin Wall not so long ago. It has also collapsed. So the Chinese government attempt to have censorship over internet by building firewall or not will eventually not work, and freedom will prevail in China and for Tibetan people. Till that day, I think Tibet in particular and China in general will remain one of the toughest challenges for people who believe in freedom, media, and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Grigory Yablinsky.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very thankful for this invitation and for one more opportunity to speak to you in Prague on the Forum 2000. The title of this debate seems very simple, and the speech can be, which I want to make, very short. I can say, no free press, no freedom. That's it, full stop. Very simple and clear. But of course, the devil is in the details. I'm very often asked whether there is a freedom of speech in Russia. And my answer is, yes, of course, we have freedom of speech. The problem is with the freedom after the speech. So this is the thing which explains what's going on in Russia in the best way. Russian case, in that sense, also is very clear. Russia have no free, independent, but I want to stress politically influential media. Simply no. We have honest newspapers, we have honest internet resources, but they are not politically influential. The moment when they become popular, they always stopped and destroyed. The same second. So you can make speeches as long as you want, but no impact and no influence. The problem is that all politically influential media in Russia belongs to the state, and I want to be very direct, is operating by Mr. Putin himself, especially if we are talking about the most influential television channels. He's taking all key decisions in this area because he believes in television, because he was born by television. So he is looking on television like on something which was the key of his political birth. Another part of our media belongs to business, as everywhere. But the problem is that in Russia, business also belongs to the government. So from all directions, you would come to the media, whether it is directly belong to the government or it belongs to the government through the business. This is a very complicated situation. The people in Russia, and they are very often accused by that, is not very demanding to a free press. They are not just pressing, there is no such special rallies. Also, they understand that the free press and honest press is a big value, but the problem is that they were betrayed by press in Russia, especially during the 90s, when it was created a kind of a semi-criminal economy and a semi-criminal state. And the people have no confidence in press at all. And the government is very much interested in that process, and it supported this process very strongly. The government have a great interest and great stake that the people don't want to have free, politically influential press. But taking the problem wider, I want to use this opportunity to address you this problem even more wider than simply the Russian case. It is fair to say that disappointment, deep political and social disappointment of the people, despair, loss of trust and belief, loss of vision of the future is not only the Russian case. It's scaring for me and very alarming that this process becomes wider and wider in Europe itself, especially in Eastern Europe. In Hungary, in Romania, in Slovakia, in Poland, and even in Czech Republic. Look at your own regional elections 1 week ago. People completely disappointed by politicians, by corruption, and by social problems, not only in Russia. People expressed no confidence in politicians, in establishment, in state institutions. Why I'm talking about that? Because look carefully, as a remedy, some even Middle European countries are looking for authoritarian solutions. They're looking the way out from that situation using the authoritarian approach. You can see it, of course, you can see it in Russia. It started at the end of the 90s. You can see it in Hungary, in Romania, and some other countries. What that means? That means that the press is approaching a new era. This is a new era when we are facing the problems with the political elite, with the national identity inside the European Union, with the wrong working institutions, first of all, the institutions, courts and justice. And that brings us to the attempt, I mean, many societies brings to the solution which I can call limitation of freedom. And I want to stress, it's an absolutely wrong thing to do. Look at our experience. It's a completely dead end, but nevertheless, it's moving forward. And the last point, what I want to say, freedom of media is absolutely crucial. That means that societies have to pay today a big price for this freedom. That means that it's necessary to do everything is possible to separate media from the government, whatever governments, from business, and from special personalities. We all need public media, really public media. We need laws which would protect, special laws which would protect independence of media. And this issue is crucial from the point of view of future. In this situation of despair, of no confidence, of no vision of future, in the conditions of serious economic recession, in the conditions of unclear future even in the global economy, this issue may be number one, to have professional, independent, honest media. And it is necessary to start this process as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if I sum up the first round, it's a rather bleak view of the situation in the world. We have one superpower in East Asia trying its best to limit the freedom of speech, of communication, etc. I'm talking of China, of course. We have, at the other end of this panel, Russia, with its ambiguous situation, media that are to some extent free, but that are of no consequence to the large political situation, which shows authoritarian traits. We have the inexorable tide of technological change of which Gareth spoke, which will make governing diverse societies to some extent difficult, and which does not bring social progress. And we have a situation in, I can say, Eurasia to some extent, as far as it was described by Dunja and Mijatović, because essentially OSCE is an organization uniting European countries plus some countries of Central Asia in the post-Soviet world, plus some Caucasian countries. You said that the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of media was under constant danger in most of the countries participating. You mentioned the number of 56 states that are part of the OSCE family. Now, where does that leave us? Gareth, you were, I think the only optimistic note here was promoted by Bay, in that she stressed the need to stress civil societies everywhere, and the attempts that public diplomacy can try in this direction. Gareth, you were on several international global commissions. Is the global situation really so bad? Isn't there also a long-term trend to the opening of societies, to the enlargement of freedom of speech, etc.? Let's just mention a few developments of the last few years, the color revolutions in various countries of the post-Soviet world, the so-called Arab Spring. Well, if we go back 22 years ago, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and so on and so on. Isn't there a lot of ground for hopes?
Yeah, I think there is reason for optimism in terms of the general trend lines. We can be very unhappy indeed about the backsliding that's occurred in Russia, which Grigori has articulated so well, although maybe it's not so much backsliding as just not a movement out of the Tsarist regime, which has always been there in one incarnation or another. We can be upset, as Lobsang obviously is deservedly, about the repression of information and argument in the Chinese media as this superpower tries to come to terms with modernity and the implications of being the global country that it is, but remains incredibly nervous about internal situations. But overall, I think the quality of governance around the world is actually improving. Overall, we're doing, although this is completely counterintuitive for most people, we are doing much better than we were 2 decades ago in terms of conflict, violence, killing of people in conflict situations, despite the horrors now of Syria and Congo and Darfur and the other situations that we're all familiar with that keep on going wrong. There's been a hell of an improvement in the reduction of conflict generally, in the number of people dying in overt conflict. And part of the reason for that is we're getting much better at early warning, at conflict prevention strategies, at responses to situations. We have a growing sense of moral responsibility in the world to respond to these situations, and we're much better informed now about catastrophic atrocity crimes that are being perpetrated in various countries, which once were completely out of sight, out of mind, and we used to be dependent solely on what we call the CNN effect for those situations to come to our attention. Now we have all the resources of social media, the Twittering and the Facebook stuff and the communication from mobile phones and so on that is making information about what's actually happening, what's going wrong, real-time information, and that means that governments are under much more stress to respond effectively than has been the case in the past. Now, there's all sorts of things that are going to go wrong and keep on going wrong, but I, for one, am something of an optimist that the trend line is actually improving, but we have to paddle like hell to ensure that it stays on track and work very hard to draw attention to those situations where darkness still prevails and bad policy still prevails, and there are plenty of those in various parts of the world.
Bay, we have mentioned the situation in the two superpowers, Russia and China. The only superpower with a long tradition of free speech, free media, etc., is the United States. Can it play a special role in this situation in promoting freedom of speech everywhere, even in authoritarian regimes? And will such efforts, for example, not fall victim to, let's say, the reset of US-Russian relations? Does the US treat on a minefield here?
I don't know if I would say that it's a completely unique special role, because I think there are other governments, for example, here in the Czech Republic, that work to promote free speech and democratization in democratizing countries right now as well. But I do think that President Obama has made it a real priority to say that when journalists are intimidated or attacked, or imprisoned, or disappeared, that's a real, that causes self-censorship, that causes fear replacing truth, and that all of our societies suffer as a result. I was going to follow up on what Gareth said, that there's a fundamental change in media now with the speed and the globalization of information. And when I was in Afghanistan in 2001, we had these old clunky satellite phones, and so we had no idea what was happening in the next town, let alone the rest of the world. In a way, it was sort of a pure form of journalism, because we could only report on what we were observing around us. But that very rarely happens now. So even in North Korea, where I've been a couple of times, you see the effects of having South Korean media, of Chinese, things on the internet coming in, and so it is. In a way, I think it's difficult for authoritarian and repressive regimes to continue on this line.
Grigory, if I understood you correctly, you spoke of a certain harmony between the government and a large section of Russian society, in that both are not interested in free media, promoting free speech, etc. I understand the motives in the case of the government, but where do you see the motives in the population at large? Why is, as you suggest, the Russian society so passive?
No, the main idea which I want to express was that the government have a very deep interest in neutralizing society, in making society passive, because the passive society is not making any problems to the government. And that's it, very simple. And from the other side, the society have a big disappointment in its experience with the media, which was in the middle of 90s. And that's why here they're meeting each other. And this is a big problem for the society as a whole, for the country as a whole. This is the first issue. Secondly, I want to say that, I want to disagree to some extent with Gareth, what he said, that he see a positive movement up. I wouldn't say so. I would say that why the colored revolution have no positive impact at the end of the day. Look at Ukraine, for example, or the other countries. The problem is that society and the people were trying to do its best. But by the way, the end of the Cold War and the trend of color revolutions was misinterpreted by the world political elite. What the idea came to us, the end of history. But now we see that that was a completely wrong idea of the end of history. It was end of strategy, that is true. It was not end of history because the world after the Cold War became more complicated, more diversified, more differences in the world. The countries and the government should think how to live in these differences. This misinterpretation is bringing the people to the very deep despair. And the last point. I have a feeling that the technical possibilities in media, for example, and IT technologies are uncomparable with the mood of the intellectuals in the world and with the societies with their intellectual possibilities. They're going much forward, and the people simply don't know how to use it. And they're using it for very simple and very, I would say, unimportant things. Entertainment, different type, and so on and so forth. And this gap between technical possibilities and intellectual mood of the societies is also one of the problems of the current media. That's what I think.
May I take up on a point? I think when you mentioned the situation in Eastern Europe, namely the spread of what you called similar trends as to those in Russia in Eastern Europe, the disappointment of the general population with the state of the political elites, the disappointment with corruption, etc. I would contradict you by saying that we know of the cases of corruption because of the free media here. Take the Czech Republic.
We know the cases of corruption even without free media. And so what can we do with this? And we have disappointment because we know that we have a corrupted officials everywhere, everywhere. And you have corrupted scandals, certainly different scale, but result?
My point is that without a free press, we would know much less about corruption.
Of course, we can't.
So that in itself is progress. Gareth, you were contradicted to some extent by Grigori. Do you want to come back on that?
Well, again, I think Grigori is being too pessimistic, perfectly understandably, because of the deeply depressing environment he finds himself in and the impatience with the community that insists on being dumbed down and operating in that environment. But try and stand back and think about just the global things that are happening. Try and evaluate this move toward political freedom that has been dramatic worldwide over the last 25 years. Try and evaluate the extent to which conflict has actually dramatically reduced, partly attributably to the explosion in information communication and the inability to pretend that bad things are not happening. Come to grips with and give some recognition to the reality that whereas we had one CNN before throwing the spotlight of global attention on horrible situations, now with mobile telephones and so on, we have millions of CNNs effectively.
And millions of situations.
And I mean, okay, a lot of the analysis is...
Even more situations than before.
Yeah, but it gives us the chance at least to respond more effectively with more knowledge, more information, and more credibility. Yes, we're lacking political leadership. It's lousy in most parts of the world. I think we acknowledge that. But the task, I think, is not to descend into total despair about this. It's to hang on to the gains that we have made and to put real pressure on ensuring that those gains continue with a far more sophisticated and intelligent and responsive policy response to some of these things than we're seeing at the moment. But that's what forums like this are about, to put that spotlight on things that are still not going well and to keep that pressure moving.
Dunja, you said that freedom of speech, of expression in media was under constant threat, daily threat, within your field of experience, within the organization you represent. 56 states, about a fourth of the world's states. You have experience outside the OSCE as well. You've worked in Morocco and other exotic places. Could you say whether there are any emerging global standards in terms of the guarantees of the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of media? Isn't there a general consensus, let's say, at the UN level about the safeguarding of these freedoms? After all, the UN also has UNESCO as its organization, which is to some extent involved in the field of freedom of creation, freedom of expression. So do we see emerging a worldwide standard by which all countries can be measured?
Well, it's a tricky question. What we have is Article 19 as a global standard.
Of the Charter of the United Nations.
Yes, yeah. And that is something that all countries should be complying with and respecting. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Not only with this charter, but with many others. OSCE, at OSCE we have media freedom commitments. At the Council of Europe you have recommendations, declarations, conventions. European Commission has a keys, and all these documents, they sound wonderfully when you read them, and they are put on paper as leading the countries in their fight and striving for freedom. But unfortunately, we do not live in an ideal world, and if you look at implementation of all these conventions, the situation is not rosy at all. The issue of the laws and regulations, it was mentioned on several occasions here at this panel. Sometimes the law can be excellent law. You spoke about public media and the importance of having public media. In the Balkan, for example, the first thing that was introduced after the war is transforming state broadcasters to public service broadcasting. This struggle is ongoing, and I do not see it's going to in a very positive direction. Maybe it is connected with overcoming the legacies from the old system. Maybe it is connected to economic situation, but it seems that it doesn't work. So you introduce good laws, countries are adopting, so governments are adopting the laws, implementation is zero, and actual answer is that there is no political will to change the societies to become more free and to actually use free speech as a human right. What is also very visible around the world is introduction of new laws, laws on blasphemy. In Russia recently it was introduced in Duma. It is still ongoing, the discussion. I intervened on several occasions in relation to this and many other laws. Decriminalizing defamation was one of the landmarks that Russian Federation did last year, but after 6 months they recriminalize it, which is showing that it is a vicious circle in so many countries.
Defamation of organs of the state or such?
No, defamation of libel. Yeah, so it's something that my office is promoting within the OSCE region. At the moment we have only 14 countries that have criminalized defamation, including US. In Europe you have only few members of the EU that decriminalize defamation, which I think it's very negative. It is not actually showing, it's not a leading example when it comes to other states, but it has enormous chilling effect on free media around the world. And this is something that we are focusing and trying to work on with the countries in order to make this as a first step of making media more free than it is at the moment.
Lobsang, in your case, in the case you have described, we have a very asymmetric conflict. A small people, the Tibetans, with a large homeland, however, against a very populous country, continental China, with 1 billion and more people, with a strong central government, etc., with all the organs of an authoritarian state. what do you expect from the outside world to do? How can it help your people to promote their cause and perhaps make it known to the Chinese on the street?
What is happening in Tibet, on the one hand, it is a challenge for Tibet and Tibetan people. On the other hand, it is a challenge for the whole world. Because we discuss about media's contribution towards freedom, being optimistic or pessimistic. And as I put forth, at least I try to put forth the argument that what is happening in Tibet is not just the virtual censorship in the virtual world, but also in the physical world. And then I think some of the experts commented that, but we should look at positively because world is changing rapidly, technology advancing, thereby spreading freedom through free media. And we talked about CNN effect. But what about CCTV effect? Because there's a reverse propaganda now. Reverse, instead of spreading freedom through CNN effect, there's censorship of freedom through CCTV effect. Chinese government is spending billions of dollars. If you go to any hotel, even in Europe now, there's CCTV. And they give you the Chinese narrative as to what's happening in Tibet, what's happening in China, what's happening in, around the world. Not only you don't have access to Tibet and China about these three T's, Tiananmen, Tibet, and Taiwan, but now there's a reverse propaganda where people are made to buy the Chinese narrative. And we talk about New York Times effect. What about Global Times effect? There's Chinese newspaper around the world where you read, they give you their narrative. We talk about Radio Free Europe. What about Chinese radio? Instead of freeing, rather censoring, self-censorship, and it has corrosive impact around the world. Nowadays, politicians, even in the Czech Republic, the country of Václav Havel, country of Velvet Revolution and Prague Spring, is censoring themselves. Business people are censoring not just on Tibet, but also in China. Academics are censoring themselves, speaking out about Tibet because, hey, that's China. You can't talk about it. So, and what to do about, I think, remains the biggest challenge for the whole world. So, even though I would like to be in the optimistic group, and that there is a linear progression towards more freedom. But then there is this reverse effort where the progression is disrupted, and disrupted not just violently, disrupted in such a way that they are using the same technology to reverse propaganda. So what could Tibet do? Like I'm trying to do is highlight what is happening inside Tibet. We are not saying what's happening inside Tibet will happen to the rest of the world, but we would like to point out what the Chinese government is capable of and what is happening on a daily basis. Academics worry whether they'll get visa to go to China or not, thereby don't write anything critical of the Chinese government, far less on Tibet. So do you want that kind of world or not? So this is the big question before the world and big challenge before the world. So whether you exchange your moral values for money, power or not.
Dunja, you... Dunja, I wanted to come back on this.
Just a small remark on the current situation. Well, what we also see that this suppression is moving from offline to online world. And the way some governments are trying to solve certain problems in the societies, I mean, we can mention Innocence of Muslims video clip. Many governments are of the opinion that they can solve this problem by blocking this particular clip. And that's not the case. That's the lost battle. That's a wrong approach, because what are we going to do if we have similar movie tomorrow? We had this kind of content before, we have it now, we will have it in the future. So building new walls, you mentioned firewall, but I would call them electronic walls or electronic curtains instead of concrete ones that we managed to sort of get rid of, is not going to bring us in a better and more freer world.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 20 minutes until the end of this panel. Please, if you have any questions, raise them. Raise your hand. Tell us your name and to whom the question is addressed, please. It's somewhat difficult for me to recognize whether there are any hands raised at the moment because I have the lights against me. Is there one? If that's not the case, oh yes, there is one. Yes, please, sir.
Thank you. James Randerson, Environment and Science News Editor at The Guardian. I've just come from another discussion at the forum about media business models, and I think it feeds into this discussion in a way, but it hasn't come up yet. The fact that so many good quality newspapers around the world are having to close because of the shift of readership to the internet and sort of failure to adapt to that quick enough, and the rise of the blogosphere and alternative places of getting information and so on and so on. So my question really is, does the panel think that that poses a big problem in terms of asking difficult questions to power and media freedom and so on, and do they see the blogosphere as an alternative that can be useful in that regard?
Sorry, I didn't understand whether your question was addressed to one particular member of the panel or all?
Whoever wants to pick it up, I think.
Okay. Gareth?
Well, I think this is a very serious problem. The decline in people on the ground employed by the major papers to do the detailed long-term thinking, analysis, putting in context the massive flood of information that is circulating on social media and elsewhere, and working through the consequences, implications of it. You don't get that stuff from the daily bloggers. You don't get it certainly from the twittering. You don't get it from the instant messaging that goes on. You get a vast flow of information which has the advantages that I previously described, but it has to be accompanied by really thoughtful, detailed analysis and drawing out sort of the policy implications and how to put these things in context. Similarly, with diplomacy in governments, there's been a bit of a dumbing down in an awful lot of governments' capacity to read situations on the ground because of budgetary constraints and security constraints, and a perception that it's not as necessary as it used to be thought to be the case to have boots on the ground, just deeply steeped in the local culture and deeply steeped in the personalities and the trends and the currents that are working. And that can lead, that combination of less access and less flow of thoughtful, considered information, it can lead to some pretty bad decision-making, some pretty poor responses, because there is an interactive process between what the good quality media is doing and telling governments and what governments are telling themselves. And I think when that's working in a synergistic and mutually reinforcing fashion, it can be very helpful in creating good policy. But when you're losing those elements, it sometimes makes for very erratic policy. Similarly with government spokesmen, people who are ministers now are having to react 10 times a day to the latest bit of instant news coming from somewhere without the opportunity to contextualize it, to get other bits and pieces of information to put it together, which is traditionally the role that's been played by correspondents on the ground, traditionally the role that's been played by diplomats on the ground. So if we lose that capacity for effective contextualization, we lose something that I think is very, very very important in good quality decision making. But what the answer to recreating it is, nobody knows, because the business models are all dead, I'm afraid.
I presume what the gentleman in the audience was referring to was, among other things, the recent demise of the paper version of Newsweek magazine. Some years ago, we lost the Christian Science Monitor and so on. As a journalist who may one day become an active journalist again, how do you see the situation of the print media?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, I'm one of the strongest advocates of traditional sort of foreign correspondence and having sort of boots on the ground. When I was in Afghanistan, I thought some of the most influential stories were done by the people who, you know, sort of counterintuitively actually had all of the resources to do real in-depth, you know, investigative work. So for the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, they really affected policy, and I sort of saw that from both the journalist and the government perspective. But I also think that there's some really interesting stuff that's being done using kind of new technologies and using social media. So for example, Ushahidi in Kenya sort of started using sort of citizen journalism and you know, sort of mapping it out on social media. I think what's important is having a really good curation system. So I think the question of, you know, sort of how you use citizen journalism to be effective and actually sort of trustworthy is that, you know, people are still exploring ways that, you know, sort of gatekeepers can play that role. So, I actually think that, you know, that's a really interesting way to look at sort of what journalism may become, because it's all about credibility. And, you know, the reason you go to the New York Times and you don't, you know, look at, you know, like certain blogs that may not be as credible. It's just about reputation. And so, I think that's a good question.
Other questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Jan Koral. I'm independent journalist. I have a question for Mrs. Funk and Mr. Evans. And I would like also to thank you, Mr. Jawlinski, that you described very well situation in media, that they are controlled by governments and by corporations, and also other panelists very well criticized censorship in Russia and China. But I think it's quite maybe hypocritic that to criticize censorship in these countries when we have so big censorship and manipulation in Western countries. And I want to point for only one event, and there are 9/11 2001 events in United States. And everybody who can use the internet find out very quickly that the mainstream story is totally false. So I would like to ask you, have you ever really, truly and honestly researched the story, and have you ever tried to break the global censorship in mainstream media about these events? Thank you.
9/11?
I know many journalists personally who covered 9/11 and who risked their lives to cover 9/11, and I think in the mainstream media it was covered very accurately. So that's all I have to say about that.
Well, I'm sorry, I agree with that. I'm as suspicious as anybody about media manipulation and media storytelling. I should perhaps tell you that my very first job as a lawyer when I was a very young man was to do a pro bono attack on Rupert Murdoch in Australia when he was trying to get a toehold in the television universe from his previous newspapers. I failed abysmally and made a lifelong enemy of Rupert Murdoch, but it's perfectly true that there was a big chunk of the Western media that has a long, long tradition of manipulation and, you know, just telling stories that are untrue or putting a spin on it for ideological reasons, and we have to be acutely conscious of that, very acutely conscious, and not just making the assumption that the media generally is always a good thing and always disinterestedly committed to telling good stories. I mean, it's not as bad as in Russia that poor old Grigori has to live with, but you do have to be very beady-eyed and skeptical about an awful lot of stuff we read in the mainstream print media, television media in the Western world. So to that extent, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I don't think you'll find me too helpful in rewriting 9/11.
Dunja.
Just a small, I mean, you mentioned that here we only criticize certain countries, and I do not think so. I think several of us pointed out on several occasions that there are problems everywhere, and that no country is immune when it comes to relation to problems with free speech and free media. We mentioned Hungary, we mentioned many countries moving in a very negative direction. My office is also known for not pointing out a finger only to the countries which are known as problematic for many years, but there are countries that are known as you know, cradles of democracies struggling with free speech at the moment. So I think that the message, at least from my office, is that we are concerned not only about new emerging democracies, but also all democracies continuing to be leading examples, and unfortunately that's not the case at the moment.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, the lady over there, please.
Jana Karásková, jestli můžu mluvit česky. I'll speak in Czech. So let me say about a very small influence of a citizen to do anything against media censorship, or, well, against censorship in public media. Together with some other people, we send a lot of information from alternative media to Czech television, Czech public television. Czech public television never responded that we also attended the meetings of the Czech Public TV board, which should supervise objectivity and balance in the newscasting and also watch out for censorship. We attended the meetings many times. We have written many complaints, and no one has ever replied to our letters and complaints. So then we have decided, now recently we decided to really sue the general manager of Czech Public Television. We don't know what will happen, but even in the Czech Republic, many things are censored, many stories are censored, even some very serious stories like the Syrian conflict. Now on the Facebook we get news, and we even get mobile phone information or pictures from people who live in Syria, but Czech television has never responded to these news. It never responds, or the preparation of a nuclear weapon by Iran or the Israeli nuclear program is never mentioned, although the Israeli radio had some shocking news from the former government advisor about the missiles which are directed at the European capitals, but it must never be broadcast. This is prohibited, etc., or information from pharmaceutical companies that the Dexter company could have endangered the lives of Czech citizens by their product, etc., etc. I don't want to go into detail, but there is a lot of similar information, but no one, and the board of Czech Public TV has never responded, and they should really supervise objective news. So we don't know what will happen, and we are very unhappy about the quality of public media, especially Czech television, which affects people a lot. And people think that editors would be ready to offer these news, but it's not true. Well, I'll ask you maybe, well, it's not a question really. Thank you.
About the state of the Czech media, and undoubtedly there are problems with the Czech media, even with public radio and public television, as in every democratic country. You're right in directing your complaints to the Council of Czech Television or Council of Czech Radio, who were appointed to take account of such complaints. And there are other ways, surely, to try to raise your objections, for example, through your MPs in Parliament and so on. But I'm afraid this was not a question to the panel. Is there any other question? If not, let me, oh yes, there is one in the back, please, over there.
Thank you. I'm Danielle Ortiz. I'm a student from the US, currently studying abroad in Prague for the semester. And my question to you was, do you think it's ever possible to completely have an unbiased media? Our current media contains polarized opinions in the form of CNN and Fox. So I was just wondering, even with the existence of citizen journalism, if it's possible to take out biasness from news sources.
May,
Is that
would
just
you?
for me? Is that a question for me?
Well, why not?
Okay. Well, you know, it's an interesting question. I think journalists talk about this a lot. You know, is there ever objectivity? I do think that in the U.S. system, it's different from in Europe, as you might have found out. You know, in Europe, there's a lot more kind of overt opinion in journalism, and newspapers are kind of divided either self-consciously rightist or leftist or whatever. In the U.S., I think we still strive towards an ideal of objectivity, and you can kind of decide for yourself whether whether we achieve that. But I think you know, when I was a journalist, for example, you know, you do try to get all the different sides of a story. You know, you might say that, yeah, I mean, me as Bei Fang, I might have decided to pursue, you know, this one story instead of another one, or I may have, you know, instinctively decided to talk to a woman instead of a man. These are all things that, you know, you can't really know exactly sort of what goes into these minute decisions, but I do think that we have this ideal of objectivity in the media.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, time is up, I'm afraid. And I would like to thank all the participants in this round. Bei Fang, Dunja Mijatović, Gareth Evans, Lobsang Sangay, and Grigory Javlinsky. Thank you very much for coming to Prague and participating in Forum 2000. We now have a 15-minute pause, and the program continues in this hall at 16:15 with a debate on media, economy, and politics. But there are other events taking place in parallel at the conference hall downstairs, Women Leaders panel, and at the Knights Hall, the Nile River, a problem that is not drying out. Thank you very much for your participation, and see you in 15 minutes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.